Tonight's presentation is titled Reviewing the Flight Review. And our presenter is Professor Paul Shuch. Paul is continuing in his series of most interesting webinars for us. He's the founder of AvSport of Lock Haven in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, where he does training for Sport Pilot and an Evector Sportstar Max. Paul holds a commercial single-engine land pilot certificate, a CFI certificate. He's also a light sport repairman for airplane, gliders, weight shift, and powered parachutes. He's an independent Rotax maintenance technician. He holds a PhD in air transportation engineering, a veteran of the United States Air Force, founding member of the Fraser Lake Air Park out in California, and a lead representative for FAA safety team and a member of the EAA. Paul, it's great to have you with us tonight, and I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you, Tim. It's great to be back. Good evening, fellow pilots and fellow EAA members. Welcome to this week's EAA webinar on how to get the most from your 24 calendar month flight review. This is an FAA Safety Team Wings Award webinar. For those of you attending live, the process of obtaining your Wings credit has already been explained to you. For those of you catching this particular presentation on the instant replay, you can still get Wings credit for viewing the webinar in the EAA Webinars viewer. All you have to do after you've viewed the presentation is log on to faasafety.gov and request credit. You can specify my name as the person giving credit. I'll get an email from the FAA, and I'll go online to my Wings page and give you credit for the FAA Wings Award for your attendance. Of course, I thank the Experimental Aircraft Association for making this series of, well, nearly 200 webinars now over the years possible. I have to put in a shameless plug at the outset for my little flight school, AvSport of Lock Haven on the Piper Memorial Airport, birthplace of the Cub, the original sport airplane. Our thanks, of course, to Aircraft Spruce and Specialty Company for providing us the bandwidth required to do these webinars. And of course, I must acknowledge your FAA safety team. Now, you know that every pilot needs to review his or her currency each 2 years through a process that the FAA now calls a flight review. We used to call it a biennial flight review. That's changed, and we'll tell you why in tonight's presentation. We're going to review the most recently revised advisory circular that the FAA has issued about flight reviews, discuss various different methods of complying with it, and my intention is to help you and your CFI to make this whole process pleasant and productive. Upon successful completion of this class, you will understand the need for establishing currency. You'll know when you're due for your next flight review. You'll be able to choose among several different compliance methods. You'll coordinate with your CFI to select the appropriate tasks for your flight review. You'll prepare for your chosen ground and flight activities and thus maintain your FAA currency for the next couple of years. But before we prepare you for a flight review, let's review a little bit of history. We'll dig into the dusty old archives, and what we're going to find is that back when pilot certificates were made of paper and airplanes were made of fabric, there was no such thing as a flight review. Once a pilot, always a pilot. You got your certificate and you were good to go. Of course, you had to have your medical certificate had to be up to date, but other than that, you never had to fly with another instructor. You never had to take any sort of recurrency training. You were a pilot forever. And that kind of worked, except by the 1970s, the FAA and the NTSB were noticing something interesting. The pilots who were most frequently represented in the accident database were pilots who, one of two things, either they had not flown in a while and were not terribly current, or they had been flying very regularly and repeating the same mistakes over and over again, without ever anybody checking to see if they needed a little refresher. So in the 1970s, the FAA proposed that all pilots should have a flight review with an instructor annually. Once a year, they wanted you to go up with an instructor and chip away at that accumulated rust. Well, as you can imagine, all of the alphabet organizations, EAA and AOPA and the various different type clubs, they all objected loudly because, after all, the process of having to go to an instructor and take what was perceived as a test was invasive and expensive, and besides, they were taking away from you a privilege that you already had. How could they do that? Well, there ensued considerable discussion. The FAA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, and they opened it up for a comment period, and then all the comments were published, and then they opened it up for a reply comment period, and all the reply comments were published, and then they issued a revised proposal for rulemaking, and then they opened that up to comments, and this dragged on for a while, but ultimately the compromise was that the FAA agreed you only needed to do a flight review every 2 years, what they called biennially, and this became known as the biennial flight review. We don't call it that anymore, we'll get into that later, but every 2 years they decided you needed to go up with an instructor just to make sure your skills were all up to par. And how often? Well, the original rule was obviously written by people from the legal profession. They said that you could not act as pilot in command unless you had had a flight review, here's the language, since the beginning of the 24th calendar month before the month in which that pilot acts as pilot in command. They couldn't have made it more obtruse. Everybody understood that meant every couple of years you had to go up with an instructor. But the FAA really still wanted you to do recurrency training every single year. So this is the time that they created the WINGS program. It's gone through several iterations and several name changes, but they started issuing an award for those pilots who every year receive some form of recurrency training. And originally, the requirement was you had to attend 3 safety seminars, and you had to do 3 flights with an instructor, and the flights were structured. You had to do one flight involving takeoffs and landings, one involving air work, and the other involving hood work. And then they issued you a little certificate and even a lapel pin. Oh, the way that lapel pin came about was rather cute. One of the first presenters at a WINGS seminar at the end was asked by somebody in the audience, well, don't we get a pin for attending this? Well, it just happened that this particular presenter had in his pocket a little envelope full of safety pins. So he went up to the person raising the question, and he pinned the safety pin on this pilot's lapel, and he said, here, congratulations, you've earned a safety pin. And the joke was not lost on the audience, but more important, they had commercial sponsors step forward and pay to have nice little WINGS pins provided for people completing a phase of the WINGS training. As I say, the program has evolved over the years, but that was intended to be for the in-between years when you weren't doing flight reviews, to encourage you to get recurrency training every single year. Now, let's do a quick little review exercise here before we move on. Tim, would you please launch the first poll question?
Looks like voting's slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with everyone.
Well, we have a variety of opinions here on this one, as I would have expected, and that's because at first blush, the words biennially and every other year and once every 2 years and once every 24 months and previous 24 calendar months, they all sound pretty much the same, and this was some of the confusion on the original verbiage. In fact, if you could transfer control back to me, Tim, I will show you that the FAA's language actually initially said within the previous 24 calendar months. Now, why do they make the excruciating language with the words calendar months? Well, that's because if you use the term 24 months, and let's say you did your flight review today, if you're supposed to do it every 24 calendar months, does that mean that on March 23rd of 2018 you're due again? Does every other year mean that you're not due until the end of 2018? What exactly does biennially mean? Some people don't know the difference between biennial and semi-annual, and that's confusing. Once every 2 years is kind of vague. So 24 calendar months has a very specific meaning. It means that whatever day of the month you do your flight review on, your next flight review is due 2 years later at the very end, at the very last day of the same month. But even that was confusing. Well, all of this, of course, was what we did back when pilot certificates were made of paper and airplanes were made of fabric. But today, both pilot certificates and airplanes are made of plastic. So, of course, as the times change, the rules change. And the flight review requirement has evolved. Now, you may wonder why I threw in that first quiz question. You're going to see why. It's to set up for the fact that something had to be simplified in the language. And when they revised the rule a couple of decades ago, they replaced this really awkward language since the beginning of the 24th calendar month before the month in which that pilot acted as a pilot in command. They've changed that to simply within the preceding 24 calendar months. Well, we all know what that means. It means you're probably expired. Check your logbooks, folks, and make sure your last flight review was within the preceding 24 calendar months. And if not, come here to Lock Haven and fly with me and we'll get you signed off. Well, this isn't the only change that was made. To find out other changes and why they were made, let's take a look at the original BFR rule. It was vague. It did not specify that ground instruction was required. And believe it or not, it also didn't specify that flight instruction was required. It didn't give you any number of hours, didn't say you even had to fly. There were no flight maneuvers specified. It was not a flight test. You couldn't fail it. You couldn't even pass it. All you could do is have it logged. And everything that you did in the flight review and the standards to which you had to perform were all left to the instructor's discretion. And this gave rise to tremendous variability from one student to the next, from one pilot to the next, from one instructor to the next. There was no uniformity. In fact, what has become known as the bar stool biennial was completely legal. At the discretion of your flight instructor, if you and the instructor and the barkeep looked at each other across the bar and talked about flying, or anything else for that matter, and if at the instructor's sole discretion you were demonstrating your competence to act as a pilot in command, the flight instructor could legally sign you off and you were good to go. You probably were only required to pay for the bartender's beer, for the flight instructor's beer, and maybe tip the bartender. That's, unfortunately, that was all too common because the regulations were not very specific. So when the FARs were amended, they put a little structure and a few teeth into the flight review. This is all found in 14 CFR section 61.56. And the new flight review requirement a couple of decades ago said you've got to have 1 hour minimum of ground instruction. And that ground instruction must include a review of the Part 91 operating rules. It also said you had to have 1 hour minimum of flight instruction. And it said that that flight instruction would include maneuvers, flight maneuvers, at the instructor's discretion. So the instructor could still decide what kind of flying you would do, cooperatively with you, but the review had to include actual flight instruction. There were still no specific flight maneuvers specified. That was between you and your instructor. It still was not a flight test. It isn't now. It's not a pass-fail test. If you do not perform to the instructor's standards, all the instructor can do is decline to endorse your logbook. And you can go up again and meet the standards of that instructor, or go to a different instructor, or find an alternative method of compliance, of which there are several that we'll discuss tonight. But you could not fail a flight review. In fact, a flight instructor is not allowed to put unsatisfactory in your logbook in the event of a flight review. The instructor's endorsement can only say satisfactorily demonstrated. So it's not a test. Now, the FARs did not specify particular areas to cover, but the FAA issued an advisory circular that does. AC 6198 says that they're suggesting, and believe me, it's a strong suggestion, you really should cover changes in the FARs. Your flight instructor has to renew his or her flight instructor certificate every couple of years. And that renewal process, that flight instructor refresher clinic, involves your flight instructor coming up to speed on any changes in the FARs. So he or she should share those changes with you. They urge you to work on airspace because there have been some issues, especially when airspace was changed from descriptors to alphabetic designators. Many of you remember back when we had positive control airspace and terminal control areas and airport radar service areas and airports traffic areas, and now we've changed the language to Class A, Class B, Class C, D, Echo, and Golf. Well, if you're not really clear on those new airspace designations, not so new now, it's been a while, but some people are still confused by the changes, so let's talk about airspace as part of your flight review in the ground instruction portion. The FAA is urging you to go over TFRs. That's something new since 9/11, the structure of temporary flight restrictions and the abundance of temporary flight restrictions mainly came into effect after September of 2001. And we still have violations of TFRs all too frequently. So a flight review, an area of emphasis that they're suggesting is let's go over TFRs. And the two leading causes of general aviation accidents have always been and remain loss of control and visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions. So those are two areas that the advisory circular is urging the instructor to include in the flight review. And if your instructor would like to see this list, please refer her to my webinars because not all flight instructors have gotten the word yet. These are areas that everyone should really be interested in reviewing every couple of years, maybe even more often. Which brings us to another poll question. Tim, could you launch it for me, please?
And voting is going quick on this one, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results with everyone.
Oh, it appears that we're pretty much all on the same page here. Yes, all of the above. An hour of ground instruction, an hour of flight instruction, a review of Part 91, maneuvers at the instructor's discretion, and of course a logbook endorsement from the instructor. Those are all parts of the flight review. Very good, so let's move on. There it is, all of the above. But what kind of aircraft should you fly your flight review in? Maybe you're rated in different kinds of aircraft. Maybe you fly singles and twins. Maybe you fly airplanes and gliders. Maybe you fly land planes and seaplanes. So the question always comes up, what aircraft should I use for my flight review? Well, the first problem that emerged is that a lot of people in the home-built and experimental community were flying single-seat aircraft. And for decades, I gave them flight reviews in their single-seat airplane. No, I didn't sit in their laps. What I did, and what all flight instructors did up until the rules were changed, was simply stand by the runway on the ground with my hand held. After having briefed the pilot on the maneuvers I expected him or her to perform, I would watch and give further instructions as necessary over the radio. And once I was satisfied that those maneuvers had been performed to reasonable standards, I said, okay, your hour's up, come back down. It wasn't even an hour then, it was just however long it took. I would say, okay, you can land now and let's talk about this. That was perfectly legal under the old set of rules. But guess what? Single seat flight reviews are no longer allowed. And the reason has to do with the specific requirements for a flight review that were instituted when the FAR was changed. They require 1 hour minimum of flight instruction. Now, under 91.109, flight instruction can only be performed in an aircraft with full dual controls. It says no person may operate a civil aircraft except for a manned free balloon that is being used for flight instruction unless that aircraft has fully functional dual controls. Guess what? That single-seat airplane that a lot of you flew doesn't have full dual controls. How could it? I mean, you could give me a set of controls on the ground, but they're not attached to your control surfaces. So by definition, you cannot use that aircraft for flight instruction. And since flight instruction is a requirement of the flight review, you can't use the single-seat aircraft for a flight review. I had a student a number of years ago, got his license and flew a CGS Hawk, a single-place tube and fabric aircraft. They were originally available under Part 103 as ultralights. This one was billed as an experimental amateur build and exceeded the weight of an ultralight, so it was licensed, in fact, as an EAB and has an N number. And my student flew it for years. And I used to give him flight reviews in it until the new rule came out. And then suddenly he had to go up with me in a two-seat aircraft, an unfamiliar aircraft as it happens, and get used to the idea of flying again with an instructor in the same aircraft in order to satisfy his flight review. I've given this student several flight reviews now, and he flies a two-seat aircraft with me once every 2 years, and then he goes back to flying his single-seater. It's a little bit inconvenient, but that's what the new rules require. Now, how about category and class? I have airplane single-engine land privileges. I also have single-engine sea privileges. Do I fly my flight review with wheels or with floats? Well, that's really left up to me. Do I fly it in an airplane or a glider? I have ratings for both. Do I want to fly in a glider or an airplane? The FARs are completely agnostic in this regard. It's between you and your flight instructor. Many people say, fly your flight review in the plane you normally fly. For over 30 years, I owned a Beechcraft, which I flew all the time, 100 hours every single year, sometimes more. And of course, since that was the only plane I flew, since I wasn't actively flight instructing for those 30 years, that's the plane I did my flight reviews in. It made perfect sense. It's a plane I owned. It's a plane I was out in all the time. But for those who fly multiple planes, some people argue, well, if you don't fly one plane consistently, maybe you should take your flight review in the most difficult plane, the most complex plane you normally fly. And there is some merit to this. It'll stretch you, it'll improve your skills, it'll make you reach a little bit beyond your current level of comfort, and that's a good thing, but it's not required. Other people say, let's just get it over with and fly in the simplest aircraft I fly, or I have available to me, and that's also okay. Do you do your flight review in visual or instrument flight rules? Well, if you're an IFR pilot, and you want to, and you're IFR current and you want to file IFR, perfectly legal to do your flight review as instrument flying, especially if that's the flying you do a lot of and you want to review it. Or maybe you're instrument rated, but you're not really comfortable and you'd like to get a little dual instruction. You can get an instrument proficiency check and also use that as your flight review if you and the instructor agree in advance that he or she will sign you off for both. I fly antique aircraft with tail wheels. I also fly trainers with nose wheels. Which am I going to do my flight review in? Well, it really depends on what's available at the time. But if I want to maintain my tail dragger currency, remember I have to do 3 landings to a full stop every 90 days to keep my tail dragger currency. So if I've got a conventional landing gear available, I'll probably want to do my flight review in that just to be able to knock off that requirement while I'm at it. But it's not a requirement. The FARs say an aircraft of your choice in which you are rated. There's a special rule for gliders. Glider pilots, instead of doing 1 hour of flight instruction, may do 3 instructional flights, each of which includes a flight to traffic pattern altitude. in lieu of the 1 hour training requirement. Now that's simply because you might run out of lift before your hour is up. So they say 3 flights: launch, fly down to the pattern. If you can catch some more lift, go up again and then fly back into the pattern. And then if you can catch some more lift, go up again. But if not, you land and you get another launch. You get another tow or winch launch. Or if you're lucky and have a motor glider, you launch yourself. That's a special case for those doing the flight review in a glider. That's under FAR 61.56B. Otherwise, other than a glider, it's an hour of flight instruction. Now, 61.56 is the FAR that leads you through the requirements for a flight review. Paragraph C, subsection 1, says that you have to accomplish your flight review in an aircraft for which you are rated, by an authorized instructor. So let's see about CFI endorsements. An instrument proficiency check, complex high altitude tailwheel, or other CFI endorsement, in and of themselves, they would not automatically count as a flight review. But if you're doing an instrument proficiency check, for example, it can occur at the same time you're doing the flight review, provided there's an agreement between you and the examiner, instructor, or inspector before the flight. Discuss this with your flight instructor before you fly. Now, it has been argued that a tailwheel endorsement, if you are not currently tailwheel endorsed, cannot count as a flight review, because at the time you launched, that was not an aircraft in which you were rated. On the other hand, I usually spend well more than an hour giving tailwheel endorsements or other CFI endorsements. So if we fly for an hour and I sign you off, sign your logbook, and then we go up for a second hour, now we've knocked off both. But the hour you spend learning to land a conventional landing gear, it's not a flight review because you were not rated in that aircraft at the time you did the flight. 61.56C1. Take a look at it before your next flight review. How about a medical certificate? Do you need to have a medical certificate to take a flight review? And there's a conditional answer to that. No, you don't, if you're flying an aircraft that does not require a medical certificate. Now, what aircraft do not require you to have a medical certificate? Currently, only 3 types: gliders, balloons, and light sport aircraft. That may change in the future. As we all know, there has been an effort to reform the third-class medical requirement going on for some years now. It may drag on for some years yet, so within the time span of this webinar, let us say that those are the 3 types of aircraft right now for which no medical is required. But there's another possibility. If you do not have a current medical certificate and you're flying an aircraft that would require a medical certificate, you can still do your flight review. If and only if your flight instructor is qualified and willing to serve as pilot in command. You do not have to be PIC during your flight review. You have to be rated in the aircraft. But having a medical certificate is not part of being rated in the aircraft. It's merely having the privilege of flying it as PIC. So if you're rated in an aircraft and your medical has lapsed and you want to do a flight review, ask your CFI, will you be PIC? If you own the aircraft, you better make sure your insurance will permit that. If you're renting the aircraft, you better make sure the FBO from whom you're renting the aircraft will permit the flight instructor to be PIC. But if the CFI is willing and the CFI has the right qualifications, no problem. A medical is not needed to complete a flight review. Which brings us to another review question. Tim, could you launch the next survey, please?
And voting's passed on this one, so we're going to go ahead and close the poll and share results with everybody.
And once again, we're pretty much all on the same page, so you may close the poll, Tim. For those few of you who might have been confused, the operative word in this question is must. Can it be flown in the most advanced aircraft you fly? Yes, but it's not a requirement. Can you fly a flight review in the aircraft you fly most often? Of course you can, but it's not a requirement. Can you fly it in the same category and the same class or the highest class that you normally fly? Of course you can. But the must means it must be flown in any aircraft, but it can be flown in any aircraft, but you must be rated in that aircraft. So there you go. And good job, folks. You seem to be staying awake tonight. So let's move on. Now, there are other ways to satisfy the flight review requirement besides the 1 hour of dual and 1 hour of, 1 hour of ground instruction and 1 hour of dual flight instruction. So let's talk about some of those other paths to satisfying the flight review requirement. And this is all found in 61.56. Paragraph D says that you do not need to accomplish a flight review if you have, within the period specified, which is of course the previous 24 calendar months, passed a pilot proficiency check conducted by an examiner, an approved pilot check airman, or U.S. Armed Force. In other words, if you get a rating and you fly with a designated pilot examiner, or if you're flying for a company that requires you to do proficiency checks with a check pilot, or if you're doing your periodic review in the military, all of those automatically satisfy the requirements of a flight review. But bear in mind, I, your flight instructor, am not a pilot. I'm not an examiner. I'm not an approved pilot check airman, and I'm not in the U.S. military anymore. Haven't been for 50 years. So that would not satisfy that requirement. An examiner is a DPE. A U.S. Armed Force, well, it's obvious. I have to be on active duty, or maybe, I think probably reserve would count if I'm actually on reserve duty at the time. An approved pilot check airman applies primarily to those flying for hire. The company has a check airman designated and examined by the FAA for that privilege. I am not in any of those positions. So, but that's an exception. If any of those three situations applies to you, you don't need to do a flight review. That's 61.56 Delta. Let's move on to 61.56 Echo. If you complete satisfactorily one or more phases of an FAA-sponsored Pilot Proficiency Award program, you don't need to do a flight review. That counts for your flight review. In other words, the WINGS program. If you do the 3 ground activities and 3 flight activities required for a phase of the FAA WINGS, and you submit the paperwork through, or you submit through FAAsafety.gov and are awarded a phase of WINGS, you're good for the next 24 calendar months. So a lot of the people who used to fly flight reviews with me don't anymore. Instead, they do WINGS training flights with me, and that satisfies their flight review, that along with their safety seminars that they've taken. Let's go on to 61.56 Foxtrot. This is the one that applies to me and several of you out there who are flight instructors. We CFIs have to renew our flight instructor certificates every 2 years. One means of doing so is through taking a flight instructor refresher clinic. If I take a flight instructor refresher clinic, as described in 61.197, I still have to fly my flight review, but that counts as satisfying the 1 hour of ground training. And well, it should. The flight instructor refresher clinic is 18 hours of ground training, or I guess 16 hours of ground training. Used to be 24. They've cut it back. But that certainly counts for the 1 hour, and the FAA has put that into the FARs under 61.56 Foxtrot. Let's look at golf now. This is the student pilot provision. Those of you who are flight instructors out there, did you ever have a student who was a perpetual student pilot? I had one once. She just didn't want to get her license. She didn't want to take the check ride. Everything she wanted to do, she could do as a student pilot. All she wanted to do was go out and fly the pattern occasionally and fly to a couple of specific local airports for lunch. And if that satisfies that pilot's mission, she didn't need to take her check ride. She could remain a student pilot. But You know, a student pilot, to maintain solo privileges, needs a solo endorsement from the instructor once every 90 days. So every 90 days, the student would come to me, do a flight with me, and I would sign her off for another 90 days, and she never wanted to take her check ride. Now, what happens after 2 years of this? Does she need a flight review? And the answer is no. If she's undergoing training for a certificate, whether she's ever going to get it or not, and has a current solo endorsement within the previous 90 days, that satisfies the flight review. She doesn't need a flight review. And she kept flying for several years. I think ultimately she finally got her rating, only because it was getting boring asking me to sign her off every 90 days. But student pilots, as long as you have a current solo endorsement, even though 2 years have gone by since you started, you do not require a flight review. Next paragraph, 61.56 hotel. This is a confusing one. You can satisfy your flight review in combination with meeting the requirements of 61.57, whatever that is, and other applicable recent experience requirements. Now, this path to a flight review is at the discretion of the instructor. So if you come to me and you say, show me your logbook and say, I've satisfied 61.57, or I satisfied another applicable recency of experience requirement, I can say, okay, I'll sign you off. Now, what is 61.57? Well, that applies primarily to aircrew operations, aircraft carrying passengers for hire, or an aircraft certified for one or more pilots. That doesn't apply to me. I don't fly the big guys. But if I did, then the recency of experience requirements would be satisfied in the course of doing my job, and therefore a flight review would not be required. In order to satisfy that requirement, I'd have to make 3 takeoffs and landings, I'd have to be the sole manipulator of controls, and there's some other requirements. But if you happen to be an air carrier pilot, you probably can use this general experience satisfying the requirements of a flight review. Which brings us to one more poll question. Tim, could you launch it, please?
And voting is coming in on this one, so looks like we're about wrapping up. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results.
And I see opinions are mixed on this one. What I intended here, if you could transfer it back to me, Tim. What I intended to state is that a privilege endorsement, an instructor's endorsement for a new privilege, does not automatically satisfy a flight review, because if you're getting a new privilege, then at the time you got that privilege, you were not rated in that aircraft. The flight review has to be flown in an aircraft which you are rated to operate. And if you did not have, for example, a complex endorsement, and you bring a retract to me and want to fly with me in a flight review, I can give you the training for the privilege of flying a retractable gear aircraft. But since you weren't rated in a retractable aircraft beforehand, it did not count as a flight review. So what you really need to do in a case like that is get the rating and then do the extra hour to satisfy the flight review. All the others, a new pilot certificate counts because that was an exam with a designated pilot examiner. Phase of wings counts because it involves flight and knowledge activities, and the flight activities were in a plane you were rated for. Student pilot with a solo endorsement, that counts. The proficiency check for Part 121 or Part 135, that's the approved check airman requirement that the airlines will satisfy, or the 135 operator. So the instructor's privilege endorsement falls short because it was not conducted in an aircraft for which you were rated. If you were, you wouldn't need the privilege endorsement. Now, how about flight simulators? People come to me and they say, I've been practicing on my Microsoft Flight Simulator program and I'm really good, and doesn't that count? Well, not exactly, but there are some activities on some flight simulators that do satisfy the flight requirement of a flight review. And that's covered in 61.56I, India. A simulator or a flight training device may be used under 3 specific conditions. One is you're flying in a training center that is certificated under Part 142. Now, what are the 142 simulator centers? Those are the companies like Flight Safety International that have high-end simulators that do type training for a specific aircraft to a very high level of precision. Those will satisfy the requirement of a flight review because you're flying the simulator with an instructor right there with you in the other seat, just as though you were flying an aircraft. The second requirement, the simulator has to be approved for landings, and the applicant has to meet the takeoff and landing requirements, that is to say the recency of experience requirements of 61.57, A or B. In other words, you have to have had your 3 landings in the previous 90 days to a full stop as sole manipulator of controls. And third, the simulator must represent an aircraft or set of aircraft in which you are rated. So if you fly piston singles and your simulator is for multi-engine jets, sorry, you weren't rated in that aircraft. If it required a type certificate, you're certainly not rated in it. In other words, if you're doing recurrency training in an aircraft, in a simulator that simulates an aircraft in which you're already rated, you're good to go. But if you're getting your initial rating in that aircraft in a simulator, that cannot double as a flight review, not until you've been rated in the simulator or in the aircraft which the simulator represents. All of this tells you what the requirements are, but what should you do to prepare for your flight review? Remember that the maneuvers are at the discretion of the instructor, but you have some influence here. You and your instructor are going to decide amongst you, between yourselves, what it is that you should do on your flight review. So you should come armed with some ideas of what you'd like to do. Think a little bit about what pilot skills you haven't practiced or reviewed lately. Many of my graduates come back after several years and tell me, you know, I haven't done a short field or a soft field landing or takeoff since I got my rating. I don't know if I could do a good short field or soft field takeoff or landing because my home airport is 7,000 feet of concrete. I just haven't had the opportunity. Maybe if you haven't been on the grass or if you haven't been in and out of a really short field, maybe that would be a good thing to take advantage of. You're doing a flight review anyway. You've got an instructor who presumably is qualified to give you a little guidance and practice in these maneuvers. Why not do it? Think about what you haven't done. One of my students said, since I got my flight review, I haven't done anything except straight and level. Well, that's okay. I have a placard attached to my forehead that says I'm not authorized for anything except straight and level. But if I were authorized for aerobatics or even stalls, everybody should practice them occasionally, usually when you land, because it's pretty hard to stay on the ground if the wing is still developing lift. At any rate, find something that you haven't done lately, and maybe that's a good thing to do with your instructor. Here's another thought. There's a maneuver that you mastered at one time, you met the practical test standards, but now you're rusty and you know it. And you just wouldn't be comfortable performing this maneuver unless you had an instructor on board. Guess what? This is a golden opportunity. Say to your instructor, I don't think I can do slips properly. It's been so long. Can you come up and do slips with me? That's a great task for a flight review if it's something that you're just uncomfortable doing on your own. But be sure to sit down and talk to your CFI beforehand, discuss what you'd like to do, ask your instructor for her opinion, and come to an agreement before you fly. Oh, by the way, this discussion can occur during your 1 hour of ground instruction. It's very instructional to discuss your strengths as well as your weaknesses. Well, that's what you should do before. What should your instructor do? Be prepared to endorse your logbook properly. And the proper endorsement is in 61.56, paragraph C, subparagraph 2. It says that a logbook endorsement from an authorized instructor who gave the review. It's required. All it has to do is certify that the person has satisfactorily completed the review. It doesn't say what you did. It doesn't have to say what maneuvers. All it has to say is that your performance was satisfactory. This is very subjective. If your instructor does not feel that your performance was satisfactory, there's probably a reason. And you probably know what the reason is. If you know you're botching all your maneuvers, you probably know that the instructor noticed that as well. Don't feel slighted if you don't get signed off. This is an opportunity to get a little more instruction and regain the competence that you once had when you passed your proficiency check or you passed your last flight test. If you have not achieved satisfactory performance, work at it some more and go fly again. If you really feel that the reason for your deficiency has to do with the instructor, go fly with another instructor. After all, you are the employer. The instructor is your employee. Fire that instructor if you don't feel you're getting what you need. But do fly with someone who will say at some point, yes, you have satisfactorily completed the flight review. This brings us to our final quiz question. Tim, would you launch the poll, please?
And voting's coming to a close real quick on this one, so I'll close and share results.
And I like those results. Tim, I think you can close this poll because I think we're all thinking alike on this one. Of course, you're going to do a pre-flight briefing before you fly with an instructor or another pilot for any reason. You always brief the flight. Of course, the instructor is going to want to thumb through your logbook just to see, have you flown at all in the last 2 years? Of course, you're going to talk about the kind of flying you normally do. Of course, after the flight, you're going to want to debrief it. All of the above certainly apply. Now, just a few additional thoughts here before we open it up to questions. The FAA published an advisory circular, 61.98, when the flight review was first instituted. It's gone through several revisions. The most recent revision was about 3 months ago, or 4 months ago. It is revision C. I would strongly recommend before your next flight review, you skim this advisory circular. It is 37 pages long, and it probably goes through a lot of contingencies that will not apply to you, but it's got useful information in it, far beyond what I could cover in an hour webinar here. So the limitations are important to know. What the advisory circular covers and what it doesn't. Specifically, in terms of the FARs, this advisory circular discusses 61.56, the flight review itself, and also 61.57, the currency requirements. It's directed specifically to general aviation pilots and to CFIs. The AC, the advisory circular, does not apply to 121 operations, that's the airlines. It does not apply to 135 operations, that's air taxi and charter flights. And it does not apply to 142, the certificated testing centers. If you are a 121 pilot, a 135 pilot, or a 142 simulator user, there are other advisory circulars that cover your particular situation. But with the exception of those 3 areas, you can find useful information in AC 61.98 Charlie. I recommend you take a look. I'll tell you how to get there. In addition, on the AOPA website, there's a really nice booklet, Pilot's Guide to the Flight Review, that I recommend you read. Again, it goes through a lot more detail than I was able to cover here in this webinar. In fact, I got some ideas from reading it because it's been a while since I've done a flight review. Oh, how did I avoid doing a flight review? Well, I've been adding ratings. I added a seaplane rating this year, so I'm good for another 2 years. However, I would still recommend, and I did review this little safety advisor on the AOPA website. I'll give you the links to get to that in a few moments. But First, I'm sure some of you have questions. Before we launch into them, here's my contact information. I'll leave this up on the screen for a while. You notice you can find here my cell phone number, my office phone number, my email address. If you have a question that doesn't get answered tonight, now we got a half hour for questions. I should be able to cover a lot of them, but if we don't get to you, please follow through with me. Drop me an email, ring me up on the cell phone at a reasonable hour, please. But if you have a question that I don't answer, I want to make sure your questions get answered. So do contact me, please. In the lower right-hand corner of this screen is a QR code. For those of you who have your smartphones in front of your computer, snap a picture of this QR code. It'll take you right to my contact information online. Also, in the upper left-hand corner, you see the logo of the sportpilottalk.com discussion forums. I'm the moderator on those forums. They're free. I encourage you, sign up, participate. Here's a chance to discuss your concerns with other pilots, flight instructors, mechanics. It's the most active set of forums specifically for sport aviation, and I encourage you to participate in sportpilottalk.com. Please do take the time to set up a login account, username, and make up a password. And far away, there's a variety of opinions, some of which you'll agree with, some of which you'll disagree with, but they'll generate some great discussion. So let me leave this up on the screen while I field a few questions. Tim, what do we have?
Okay, Paul, let's launch into some questions here. We got one from Mitchell here. He's wondering, does a flight review in a single engine land airplane count as a flight review for multi-engine land if he's rated for both?
Mitchell, absolutely. The only requirement is the flight review must be flown in an aircraft for which you are rated. If you're rated at single engine, multi-engine, land and sea, gliders, and powered parachutes, take your choice. Any of the above will count for all of the above.
Okay, and Dave's got a question here. He's wondering, let's see, it's worded here. Isn't it true that a CFI with a multi-engine rating but not multi-engine instructor rating cannot conduct a flight review in a twin? So I think he's saying if you're a CFI, you're rated for multi-engine, but you're not rated for multi-engine instructor.
Dave, I understand the question, and you're absolutely right. I am a CFI. I am not an MEI. Therefore, I cannot give you a flight review in a multi-engine aircraft. At least I could serve as pilot and command in the multi-engine aircraft, but the way I read the rules, I'm not rated to give instruction in it, and I'm required to give an hour of instruction in the aircraft. Therefore, since I can't give MEI instruction, I think you're right, Dave. I think you have to choose a flight instructor who has an instructor rating in the category and class of aircraft that you're going to use for your flight review. I didn't think about that before, Dave, but it's a great point. Thank you for making it.
And Ronald's wondering, can a private pilot without a medical fly with a pilot who has a medical, not acting as PIC, as long as the other pilot agrees to be PIC?
Ronald, this is very frequently done. I have right now a lapsed medical. It doesn't stop me from flight instructing in my light sport aircraft, but I cannot be PIC, let's say, in your Beach Bonanza, as I once would have been. Now, if I go up with you in your Beach Bonanza and you're an instructor, you can still give me a flight review because I'm rated for the aircraft, but since I don't have a medical, I'm not able to be PIC. Nevertheless, I can do my flight review because that's an aircraft in which I'm rated. So yes, Ronald, I would say that that's a perfectly satisfactory solution if the CFI is willing to be PIC.
And great. Walter's wondering, can the CFI sign off a flight review on a digital logbook, or does it need to be kept the old pen and paper ink logbook for this and other endorsements?
Walter, I always use a paper sign-off. It may be a sticker that I hand you, which you do with as you please. But the problem with the electronic logbook is if you are ramp checked and you're asked to show your sign-off for your flight review, you have to have something physical in hand to show. I would say if you will keep an electronic logbook, that's fine, but keep physical hard copies of endorsements. They can just be stacks of 3x5 index cards with endorsements written on them. You keep in the map pocket of your airplane, but you should have something that's physically signed. I think that would be very difficult for me to physically sign the screen of your iPad. Well, I could do that, but then you'd have to use the something to get the whiteout off your screen.
Okay, and just a quick question here. Chris is wondering, he's not too familiar about the WINGS program. Just wondering if you can briefly talk more a little bit about the WINGS program and how you accumulate the credits and the phases so it counts towards a flight review.
Chris, I'm so glad you asked, because I am a missionary when it comes to promoting the WINGS program. What you need to do, first of all, is go to FAAsafety.gov. FAAsafety.gov, and create for yourself an account. All you need for an FAAsafety.gov account is you create a username and a password. And the password has to meet certain requirements of number of characters and capitals and lower cases and symbols and numbers and all that stuff. And it explains on the website what you need to do for a password. Create the account first. And then, once you have the account created, you'll fill out an information sheet online where you're going to list what ratings you hold and when your last flight review was. And then there is, when you log on to FAAsafety.gov next time, there will be a link that says My Wings, and you click on that. It will give you a list of recommended activities. There are 3 required knowledge activities and 3 required flight activities for each phase of the wings, and you could do it every single year. And every time you do it, it processes your clock for your flight review. Now, the flight activities, there will be a list of recommendations depending on your class of license, what certificates and ratings you hold. But typically, there will be a flight activity that usually has to do with takeoffs and landings. It might say, demonstrate short field, soft field, takeoffs and landings, or whatever. There'll be an activity that involves slips, maybe it'll be in there. There'll be a curriculum sheet. You can print that out and give it to your flight instructor. Then there may be a flight activity that involves some hood work, and it'll say the things you should do under the hood. If you're instrument rated, the hood work requirement is going to be a more rigorous curriculum than if you're a VFR pilot. And there may be another flight activity that has air work, where they have you do slow flight and stalls, for example. Each flight activity does not have a specified number of hours. Some you can knock off in 20 minutes of flying, some you might need a couple of hours to master. It's entirely between you and your instructor. There is no hours requirement. But you need to satisfy those 3 flight activities. Now, if you don't like the recommended activities, there's a whole bunch of optional ones you can choose from. If you say, well, I don't really feel like doing slow flight installs because I'm an aerobatic pilot and I've got an aerobatic aircraft and an aerobatic instructor, I want to do loops and rolls. Well, there's an optional activity that'll let you do loops and rolls. So you find a curriculum and print it out, and it lists what their requirements are. Print that out for your flight instructor. The flight instructor will look it over and make sure that you've met those requirements, and then endorse that flight activity. As far as the knowledge activities are concerned, there are some core requirements that everyone has to satisfy, and then there are some optional requirements. The core requirements, when they are required, they're always available online. You'll be able to do an online course to satisfy whatever the core is. Right now, one of the hot button items for the FAA is loss of control. There have been a lot of loss of control accidents. It continues to be the #1 causal factor in accidents. It has been for decades. So they've got a whole bunch of online programs for dealing with loss of control. Some of them are written by AOPA, some of them are written by EAA. There are various different online courses you can take. And if you find one of those and it will satisfy that core requirement for the wings, great, go ahead and do that course online. Some of them are satisfied by webinars such as this one. Of the 3 activities required for a phase of wings, this particular webinar tonight actually satisfies the 3rd one automatically if you've taken it. And by the way, if you do these online webinars and request credit for them, either through Tim when you logged on through your email address, or through me after the fact if you're actually watching this webinar in the instant replay and you request credit. Once you request credit, it plugs it into your curriculum sheet on the My Wings link, and it says you satisfied that one. You'll get a green check mark by everyone you satisfied. When you've got 3 green check marks by the flight activities and 3 green check marks by the knowledge activities, you satisfied a phase of wings. You'll get a certificate in the mail. You'll get a little wings pin to put on your flight jacket, and that will automatically give you the endorsement for having satisfied your flight review. It'll be an electronic endorsement. You can print it out from the Wings website and stick it with your other endorsements or stick it in your logbook. Chris, thank you so much for asking. I hope you'll become an active participant in the Wings program.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions from folks about logbooks, and Richard summarizes it here. At a ramp check, am I given a period of time to produce documentation proving my flight review, or do I have to have it on the spot?
Richard, that's a great question. It depends on your level of your certificate. If you are a private pilot or above with a current medical, I think actually this applies as well to recreational pilot and above with the current medical, you're not required to, well, let me backtrack on that. Recreational pilots are required to carry the logbook, and the reason is recreational pilots require endorsements to fly. For example, a private pilot automatically has cross-country privileges. A recreational pilot does not unless that person has received an endorsement for cross-country operations. Similarly, a private pilot automatically has privileges for airspace, let's say towered airports, Class Delta, for example, and by extension, Class Charlie and Class Bravo. A sport pilot does not automatically get privileges for Class Charlie, Delta, or Bravo airspace, but can receive instructor endorsements to fly in those airspace. Therefore, the sport pilot is required to carry not necessarily a logbook, but the sport pilot is required to carry physical proof of endorsements, and that of course includes the flight review endorsement as well. The recreational pilot, if flying cross-country, is required to carry proof of the cross-country endorsement. If you're a private pilot or above, exercising private pilot or above privileges, that requirement does not apply to you because the endorsements are implied by the fact that you're carrying your pilot certificate. You are always required to carry your pilot certificate in your person, on your person. If you don't carry your logbook and they ramp check you and they ask, when was your last flight review? Your answer is probably going to be, gee, I don't know because that's in my logbook, but it was definitely within the previous 24 calendar months. And they may ask you then to send them a photocopy of your logbook. I've never been ramp checked, but I had something very similar occur with regard to a maintenance item because I am a mechanic. And I did not have the aircraft logbooks on my person when I was asked to prove a particular maintenance task. So, and I'm not expected to carry my aircraft logbooks, but I was told, we'd like you to fax us that page from the aircraft maintenance log, which I did, and that was fine. It satisfied that requirement. Similarly, I wouldn't be required to carry my pilot logbook if I had a current medical because I am a commercial pilot. But since I right now have a lapsed medical, I'm operating under sport pilot rules, I better carry my logbook because that's required of sport pilots. No, you don't have to carry the logbook if you have a current medical and are flying within your ratings. Is it a bad idea to carry your logbook? I don't think so. I carry mine even when I have an active medical just because I got in the habit. But the requirement is a little more loose unless you're a sport pilot or a rec pilot, and then it's a firm requirement, as I understand it.
Okay, Richard is asking, I don't have my private pilot certificate yet, but it's coming. When will my first BFR or flight review be due once I get it?
Richard, your flight review will be due at the end of the 24th calendar month after you took your flight test. Let's say you passed your check ride on March 1st. Well, you're going to be due for your next flight review on March 31st, 2 years hence. 24 calendar months after you took the flight test, not after you received the piece of plastic.
Okay, great. Question about solo flight. Larry says back in 1966, he solo flight in Aranca 7 AC Champ, and then he said then 2 hours in a Cessna 140. Does that make me legal to fly a tail dragger today?
Barry, you're in luck. I started in Aranca Champ in 1961. I love that little airplane, but that's not why you're in luck. You're in luck because the requirement for a tailwheel endorsement is more recent than your tailwheel experience. You have been grandfathered. Congratulations, Grandpa.
What was that date that it's the grandfathering clause?
If you're, I don't know the date that the endorsement went into effect, but if your tail dragger experience was before they required an endorsement, then you're good to go. He said back in the 60s. I'm sure he's covered by that.
Yeah, I do know that date. It was April 1st, 1991. So it was in 1991, and April 1st. If you had time and tailwheel before that date, then you don't need to have that tailwheel endorsement.
Tim, I'm so glad you knew the date, and of course it was April 1st.
What a joke, huh? Oh, I do that because I bought my first tailwheel aircraft, a Cessna 140A model, in December of 1991, 7 months after I got my private pilot certificate, and my instructor said, gee, you know, you're just about 9 months late, because if you would have gotten this and flown this 9 months earlier, you wouldn't need to get this endorsement. But I had to get a tailwheel endorsement because I was a few months late. That's why I remember.
But Tim, how difficult was it to get the tailwheel endorsement?
As a Cessna 140A, those spring gear hop and jump all over the place. It took it took a good number of hours for me to master that tailwheel aircraft. Let me tell you.
You would have flown it off the grass instead of the pavement, Tim.
Oh yeah, I was on pavement, but it was a joy to fly.
They sure are.
Okay, so a couple questions here that have come in about the full dual controls for flight instruction. Wondering if a Bonanza with throw-over yoke meets that requirement.
There is a specific FAR that addresses that. The short answer is yes, as long as the instructor can gain control of the aircraft promptly. The throw-over yoke is legal for flight instruction.
And how about, oh, go ahead.
I know that because I used to be a very active Beechcraft pilot, and I was actually one time on the board of the Beach Aero Club, so I flew a lot of Beechcraft aircraft, and there was a provision specifically in the FARs that as long as the instructor could gain control, you did have to have dual rudders, absolutely, but the throw-over yoke was allowed by a specific exception in the FARs.
And we had another question here then about brakes. What if it doesn't have dual brakes?
Brakes are not a requirement for flight. A lot of the antique aircraft I used to fly don't have any brakes. Of course, those were all tail draggers. In fact, some of the really old ones had a tail skid, and if you pull back hard on the stick, the tail skid was your brakes. No, there is no requirement for brakes, but you have to have dual flight controls. Flight controls is defined as the ability to operate the control services, which is rudder, elevator, and ailerons, or in the case of the Bonanza, rudder vader and ailerons.
I had a couple questions from people here about who've gone beyond their 24 months. So in other words, they haven't had a flight review within that 24-month period. So they're not current with a flight review. So how does that work for them? How do they get current?
What you have to do, folks, if you've lapsed, if you're out of currency, is fly with a flight instructor who is able to be and willing to be PIC. And if your flight instructor knows the aircraft and your insurance will cover it, or if it's a rental aircraft and the FDO's insurance will cover it, the flight instructor can say, okay, this will be dual, I'm PIC, your airplane, and then you proceed to fly as a student pilot again, basically, until you have your flight review out of the way, then you can be PIC again.
Thomas says, the wings program is great. I find that the Knowledge 3 level is not as frequently presented as the others. How are the levels determined?
Thomas, a generalization. Of course, all generalizations are untrue, including this one. But they kind of set it up so that the basic phase of wings is always performed to the private pilot level. The advanced wings standards are to the commercial pilot level. And the master wings level is to the ATP level. So I have sitting on my wall, I'm sitting in my office right now, and I've got a lot of certificates on my wall, and the one I'm proudest of, I've only ever done it once. It says Certificate of Proficiency Wings Master Level. I did it once, I'll probably never do it again, but I was very proud to be able to do that. But you have to start at the basic in any case. Every year, every time you redo the wings, you start again at the basic level.
Okay, so Richard just wanted to clarify, he says he's rated for both helicopters and fixed-wing airplanes. And he's wondering, does he have to do a flight review in each?
No, Richard, you don't. You're a qualified helicopter pilot and a qualified fixed-wing pilot. Fly a flight review in either a fixed-wing or a helicopter. The FARs don't say you have to do both. Just pick one. If you're rated in it, do a flight review in it, and now you are in flight review currency for any aircraft that you're rated to fly.
Gotcha. So David's wondering, regarding the provision that the flight review must be done under flight instruction, is not the CFI always acting PIC when giving the instruction?
David, that's an area that causes a lot of confusion because the CFI under the FARs is allowed to log PIC time whenever he or she is instructing. But there is a difference between logging PIC time and being the PIC. Only one person can be the PIC, and if you are current, that would usually be you. If you're out of currency, it has to be the instructor. However, regardless of who is the PIC, both of you, if you're current, can log PIC because that's one of the privileges that an instructor enjoys. They did that because when flight instructors, when many people started flight instructing, it was for one purpose only. It's not because they loved teaching, although some of them do. It's not because they were good teachers, although many of them are. Initially, when a lot of people started flight instructing, it was because they were trying to accumulate enough hours to be able to launch an airline career. So this was a provision that was put in so that the flight instructor who wants to fly for the major airlines can accumulate enough PIC hours to satisfy that goal.
Gotcha. We've had a number of questions come in here, and I'm going to kind of generalize them, but people basically saying that they've had flight instruction from an instructor for various reasons, but it was never logged specifically as a flight review in their logbook. Does that time that they had getting this flight instruction for these other reasons count to meet the time to get a flight review?
The time that you've received flight instruction only counts as a flight review if it was one of those exceptions that we discussed earlier, that is to say, wings training leading to a phase of wings, or a few other conditions. Otherwise, it needs to be logged explicitly as a flight review. Now, that said, if you've done that instruction, and if it included 1 hour of ground and 1 hour of dual flight instruction, you can go back to that instructor and say, do me a favor, would you give me a logbook endorsement saying that I completed my flight review? It's best if you discuss this with the instructor beforehand, of course. That way, I automatically, when I fly with somebody and what I do an activity that I feel would have satisfied a flight review, I automatically give that person the sign-off because it can't hurt to precess your clock. But if the discussion did not occur, and if the instruction, both ground and flight instruction, did occur, and if you covered the areas that are required to be covered in the ground segment, which is to say changes in the FARs primarily, changes in Part 91, if that's all been accomplished, I'm sure the flight instructor will have no qualms about signing off satisfactory performance satisfactorily completing a flight review. But that logbook endorsement that I showed you, let me go back to that slide and I'll show you what the logbook endorsement has to say. There it is. A logbook endorsement from an authorized instructor who gave the review, certifying that the person has satisfactorily completed the flight review. That's 61.56C2. Show that to your CFI and say, we've done all this, would you sign me off with these words, please? I cannot imagine a flight instructor declining, unless you just totally blew it on that last flight.
A couple questions from people, Lawrence and Edward, both kind of wondering, what about the FAA's suggestion that a person doing a flight review bring in an IACRA record?
I did a webinar recently on IACRA, as I recall. There is no requirement that a flight review go through IACRA in any way. IACRA is the FAA's Integrated Airman Certification and Rating Application. It is becoming required if you're applying for a certificate or a rating. But a flight review generally is not an application for a certificate or rating. It might be. If you go for a certificate or rating and do your check ride with a DPE, you will have gone through IACRA, and that can satisfy the requirement of the flight review. But unless you're going for a certificate or rating, you're not required to use IACRA, and I don't even know of any logical means to use IACRA for just a flight review, since it is an application for ratings and certificates.
Gotcha. And Ronald chimed in here. He just clarified, and I think it's a good thing to bring up here, but he says a Robinson R-22 helicopter has a special FAR dealing just with that one aircraft, and he just wanted to clarify that to act as PIC in there, you do got to have a flight review in the Robinson, because that one aircraft has a special FAR related just to that one helicopter.
Whoa, Ronald, obviously I'm a fixed wing pilot. I didn't know that. You know what I love about doing these webinars, Ronald and Tim? I always learn something.
There you go. That's why we're all here. And JR's just wondering, will a new rating satisfy the flight review and reset the clock?
JR, a new rating, absolutely. If it involves a check ride with a designated pilot examiner, that does reset the clock. That satisfies your flight review. If in doubt, ask the designated pilot examiner at the end, hey, would you do me a favor and sign me off a flight review? I don't know of any DPE who would decline that request.
And Barbara is wondering, how many phases of wings level can one work?
Barbara, there are 3 levels of wings. They are the basic, the intermediate, the advanced rather, and the master. You can do all 3 of them as many times as you wish, but you always have to start at the beginning each year. So here it is. This is end of March. I have not quite completed the basic wings for this year. Actually, I have. I've completed the basics. So I could now go on and do my 3 flight activities and 3 knowledge activities for the advanced wings if I wanted to do another level, another phase of advanced. And then, if I have enough time left in the year, I could do all of the 3 flight activities and 3 knowledge activities for the master wings, and I could get all 3 this year. But next January 1st, it all starts again. And there's no limit to how many phases of each you can get, but you have to go in order from basic through advanced through master every time, every year that you go through the program. You don't have to continue beyond the basic, but you may.
And Gary just makes a comment here. He says, my flight review is due in April. I have been stressing over this event, but now feel armed with great knowledge and background on what to expect and what I can do to prepare. Thank you very much.
Gary, thank you for sharing that. You should not be stressed. You should feel that you're just getting a chance to fly and have some fun. And by the way, while you're at it, you're going to get signed off. I'm sure you'll do great.
And Mark is wondering, how does a flight review relate to instrument proficiency?
Mark, that's an excellent question. If you are an instrument pilot and you do an instrument proficiency check, and if it includes an hour of ground instruction and an hour of flight instruction, and if the ground instruction involves or includes a review of Part 91, all you need to do is ask your CFII, do me a favor at the end of this check ride, at the end of this proficiency check, would you sign me off for a flight review as well? You can do both at the same time. One flight will satisfy both as long as you've met the requirements of both. So no reason to do a flight review separately if you're doing regular instrument proficiency checks. I used to do an IPC every 6 months when I had a plane that was appropriate to that. And every 6 months I would automatically, I'd do my IPC and I would ask the flight instructor who I traded off with to sign me off for a flight review at the same time. So I always had a year and a half to go on my flight review.
Very cool. Yeah, James just chimed in here. He said, every time I fly a flight check, I have fun doing stuff I don't normally do. I have been doing wings flight checks yearly, and each has been a fun event.
James, I'm so glad you're having fun. That's what flying is all about. If we're not having fun, why are we doing this?
Right on, right on. Okay, so we're reaching close to the end here, Paul. Let's try and get one or two more questions in here. But Steve is wondering, it is sometimes difficult to get an instructor to ride and give training in an experimental or LSA. Do you have any suggestions?
Steve, I understand the problem. There are those of us in the flight instruction community who specialize in LSAs and experimental. You know where you're going to find one of those? At your local EAA chapter. Ask around.
There you go. And I would just throw in that EAA does maintain a list of flight instructors who've reported to us they're teaching sport pilots. And on the list, we do indicate if they're willing to train in experimentals also. So that's on the EAA's website under the light sport aircraft section.
And I believe I'm listed on there for LSAs and experimentals.
So we had a question in here. Somebody was wondering if you're familiar with the Sporties flight review course, wondering if you have an opinion on that, or if there are any other courses that you would suggest might be, something people could get to prepare for their flight review.
If you have been flying at all within the last couple of years, if you've been maintaining currency, you don't really need to study for your flight review. Those courses are primarily tailored for the person who's been out of currency for years, hasn't flown in a long time, and is just getting back into it. I don't know specifically about the Sporties flight review material because I don't use Sporties at my flight school. I use Glime material, but they're all pretty much the same in terms of what they will do for you. And what flight review training material will do is help you get back in the groove if you're really, really rusty. But if you've been flying regularly, you're not going to be that rusty. You don't really need to do anything other than reserve the airplane, reserve the instructor, and go have a good time.
Yeah, it's probably that ground portion and reviewing the new regs and the TFRs and airspace and all that stuff maybe that people are most concerned about. Jay chimed in here and he just said that FAA Safety has a good course for the flight review.
Oh, you're right, Jay. I forgot about that. Well, in terms of reviewing the FARs, remember that that hour of ground instruction is instruction, not examination. If you don't know the rules, let your instructor teach them to you or review them with you during that hour. It will satisfy the flight review requirement at the same time you're gaining knowledge.
Great. Okay, let's get the last question in here from Sam. Sam is asking, if you go to someone like Flight Safety for recurrent training, does your graduation certificate cover the review, or does the instructor still need to sign a logbook for the flight review?
If it's a Part 142 training center like Flight Safety, that was one of the ones, let me go back to that slide, that satisfies, where was it? Here it is. Back up. Here it is. Paragraph 1, the flight simulator or flight training device must be used in accordance with an approved course conducted by a training center certificated under Part 142 of this chapter. That sounds like flight safety to me. That will satisfy the requirements as long as you do takeoffs and landings and as long as it's in an aircraft for which the pilot is rated.
For flight safety, for flight simulator training, it looks like that would be 4A.
Right, and that's what flight safety is, their simulator training primarily.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Paul. Well, great. Thank you so much. We've had a number of comments, people chiming in. I want to thank you for a great presentation, helping them prepare for their flight reviews that are coming up here. So please just take a moment and share any closing comments you want with the folks that are still logged in. On my counter, I saw probably over about 330 people that were tuned in tonight.
Oh, great, and we'll pick up another 1,000 in the instant replay. Well, for those of you who stuck it out to the bitter end, thank you for being here. I've got here on the screen some links. Don't click them, they're not going to work. They're on a PowerPoint slide. But if you want to find Advisory Circular 61.98, two places. You can get it from the FAA, and there's a long convoluted URL, or you can pick it up on my website, my flight school website, avsport.org. And there's the path. They don't need to know the path because I've got a search engine available for every single page. Click on search, type in AC 61.98, it'll take you right to it. Similarly, with the AOPA Guide to the Flight Review, there's a long convoluted URL here on the screen, but AOPA's website is also well indexed. So go to AOP.org, type flight review, and I'm sure you'll find this document. This website, this webinar, like the last dozen or so I've done, they're available on EAA.org/webinars, so you can watch it over and over again as many times as you want until you get really tired of my voice. I will encourage you to use EAA.org.webinars to find not just my webinars, but the other 190 or so that have been done over these last years. It's a wonderful resource. We thank the EAA for making these available, and I encourage you, in your spare time, watch webinars. They're fun, and you learn something. And finally, for those of you who would like access to the actual PowerPoint slides for this and all of my webinars, I make them available on my website here, avsport.org/PowerPoint, spelled PWR, point. I have my presentations copyrighted, and I have a blanket release that any of you may use them for non-commercial instructional use. If you're a CFI, go ahead, use my PowerPoint lessons. They're there for all of you. Don't sell them, don't put them on a CD and peddle it, but for personal use, for educational use, I encourage you. I do make all my PowerPoint slides available. So if there's something you'd like to review or even use from the slides, here's where you find them. Folks, this has been a great pleasure. I encourage you to go get current, but remember, the flight review is not an exam, it's not a test. It's a fun flight where you might just learn something. Fly safely, stay current.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul, for a great presentation. And to all the attendees who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night, all.